funny, isn't it? It just shows this is tribute to Kevin, because what I could have done is just kind of waited until Kev started and then gone and make myself a cup of tea and have a chat. But no, I don't want to miss anything. So I'm like, I've got to get back for Kevin. So I'm really excited. But there we go. Right, I made it. I'm in time. Thanks for waiting.
Good, good. I hope I don't go too late, but
no, go.
Are we good to go then?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So wow, Alice, that was a really good session. Really genuine and heartfelt. Yeah, I think that was great. I think it was true what you said about, no one person is right, and the research should always be taken with a grain of salt. So yeah, great presentation. But so was everyone else's, right? So congratulations to all the other presenters this weekend. Just a fantastic job. And obviously thanks to Matt for inviting me. I feel honored, and just to be a part of this amazing project that you put together. So I'm trusting late in the afternoon in the UK on a Friday evening, no less. Most people should have at least one drink in them by now. I'm sure that's where Matt just went. But I'm Kevin Maggs, and I'm going to be talking to you tonight about load and capacity. So if you don't know me, I'm the director of the USA division of the Running Clinic. And if you're not familiar with the Running Clinic, it's a continuing education course. It's taught internationally. So we talk about diagnosis and treatment of running injuries and footwear prescription, gait evaluation, training plans. We run the gamut. So along with that, I do have a bit of a history with running. I've run quite a few marathons and Ironman. I've never really been that competitive. I don't have some glorious story about how fast I am. I've just kind of always been out there in the pack, but having fun. So today, this is our agenda here. What is load and capacity? That's how we're going to start this. And then we're going to look at why it's important. We're going to try to quantify it. And then we're going to talk about the one tool you need in your office. And we're going to look at some case studies, and then we're going to put it all together. So with load and capacity, I think it's really important because the concept is great to explain why people get injured, but it's not only just great to explain the past in terms of why they got injured, but also the present, because we can use the concepts of load and capacity in our treatment to get people better. And then it's good in the future too, because if they understand the concepts of load and capacity, then they're going to be less likely to get injured in the future. So there's lots to do today. I hope we can fit it all in 30 minutes. So just to get familiar with a couple terms, when I talk about load, I'm talking about the amount of physical load that we place on the body. So that could be, shearing forces or compression forces or bending forces or rotational moments, whatever. And on the capacity side, we're talking about the ability of the body to handle the load that you place on it. So that's kind of what we're talking about with load and capacity. So way back in 2005, it was already established that training errors play a large role in running related injuries. It's been hard to define what a training error is. So 2 years ago, a review paper by 𝐂𝐤𝐞𝐫 𝐃𝐈𝐒𝐄 reported that very limited evidence existed for sudden changes in training load being associated with increased risk of injury. Now, when a paper says something like that, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that we don't have a lot of evidence to support it. And absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence, right? But of course, the clinicians in the Twitter world had their normal freak out session when this paper came out, and they're like, oh my God, training errors aren't a big deal. But we have to understand that this review was talking about training load, right? Not training errors. And these are very different. So according to this paper, they define training load as a change in distance or running volume from one week to another. But training load, I would suggest, is kind of under the umbrella of training errors. So there's a lot of things that are included in training errors. So training load, we can talk about, running volume and intensity and whatnot. But let's say you read on Runner's World that a forefoot strike is better than a rear foot strike, and all of a sudden you change the way you're running. Well, you're going to load up the Achilles and the metatarsals. And if you get an Achilles tendinopathy or a stress fracture in your foot, that's considered a training error because you've altered where the load is being applied, right? So that is still a training error. What if you change footwear? Same thing. We know that rapid changes in footwear can lead to running injuries. Same with speed work, same with the surface you run on, and even non-running load, right? Like if you're joining a CrossFit, and all of a sudden you start doing a lot of workouts at CrossFit, and you still are running the same mileage, you're increasing the mechanical load on the body, so you could still have an injury that you feel when you run, but it wasn't necessarily because of running, it was because of some other non-running load. So then on the right here, still under the umbrella of training errors, we have sleep and stress and diet, medications, previous injury, running experience. All these things on the right, these factors on the right, influence how well your body can handle the factors that I listed over there on your reading left. So for example, if someone isn't sleeping well or they're stressed out, with diet, we have REDs, all those things will affect injuries, right? Medications, as far as like fluoroquinolones, we know they're tenotoxic, so they're gonna, increase the risk of tendon problems. Tom Goom talked about novice runners being more injured than experienced runners. We know that that's the case. We're going to talk about that as we go. But these factors on the left, we would consider the load, and the factors on the right, we would consider capacity. Okay? So you have to remember it's all about adaptation, right? So the body is going to adapt to the load that we place on it, as long as the application of that load doesn't exceed the capacity of the body to adapt. Okay? So what we mean by that is, with the absolute amount, we know it's very unlikely that anybody's going to be able to tolerate running 100K a day every day. That's like too much of an absolute amount of running. But the rate is important as well, right? Because you can have situations where, let's say, we know that everybody can run marathons, and like hundreds of thousands of people do it every year. But if you take a sedentary person, you say, look, I want you to run a marathon in 3 weeks, the rate of increase of volume is going to be so abrupt that their body can't adapt that quickly. And so they're very likely to get injured. Okay. So it really has to do with load and capacity. And we have to have faith in this process. If we have faith that the body can adapt to the load that we place on it, that changes our outlook on how we deal with injuries. Over the lunch break, JF and Greg Lehman were talking about that they wish people would talk about principles. Well, that's what this whole presentation that I'm doing right now is on. The principle that your body can adapt to the load that we place on it if it's not too much in the absolute sense or too quick of a rate in the increase in the load, okay? So there's kind of 4 scenarios that I want to go over in terms of how load and capacity can influence injury. And the first one is a really positive outlook showing that a slow, controlled increase in load is going to result in a slow increase in capacity, okay? And so we're all very familiar with this. I did a presentation for the Australian Chiropractic Association about a month ago on whether or not the spinal discs can adapt to load. In other words, can exercise and load have an anabolic effect on spinal discs? And this is one of the slides that I used for this. So would you expect to see higher intervertebral disc degeneration in a swimmer where his sport has no axial compression, or in a runner where with 1 hour of running, it's estimated that there's over 1 million kilos of axial compression on the spine? And if you're wondering where I came up with that number, there's all these calculations that are referenced here if you want to look it up. But the point is, a ton of axial compression in the spine with runners versus no axial compression in the swimmer. Which would you expect to see higher disc degeneration? And if you can guess by the title of the talk, if you guessed swimmers, you're right. There's higher levels of intervertebral disc degeneration in swimmers than almost any sport where there's no axial compression. Whereas runners have 20% larger intervertebral disc height compared to non-runners, 1 point less on the 5-point Furman scale. So the Furman scale is like a grading scale that we have to rank disc degeneration on MRI. And it's all dose dependent. So higher weekly volume and more years of running correlate with better Furman grades. So in other words, less disc degeneration in runners. So that was a paper by Mitchell just this year. Daniel Balavi down at Deakin University in Australia had this one in 2017 where he looked at runners. Again, higher T2 relaxation times and hypertrophy of the discs. And again, it was dose dependent. So what I'm getting at is there's an ability of the body to adapt to load, right? Same with this one. We always hear that running is bad for your knees, right? It causes osteoarthritis. Well, we know that exercise exposure actually is associated with higher glycosaminoglycan content. And if you're unfamiliar with glycosaminoglycans, they're molecules in the in the cartilage that help absorb water. So that's kind of what we want. And then some people say, oh, well, that's just like survival bias. People with good knees, that's why they're able to exercise. But that's why I put this part here up. No, we know that as an intervention, exercise can actually increase 𝐒𝐲𝐶𝐚 content. And we know that exercise is associated with less knee osteoarthritis. I underline those ones because those studies there are on runners specifically. Okay, so it's not just discs and it's not just knees. We know that the body is fully capable of adapting. If you look at track runners over the course of one season, what we see is they're always going counterclockwise, right? So if you look at this guy's ankle here, you can see he's in a little bit of pronation because he's going counterclockwise on the left leg. But we know that over the course of one season, the inversion strength of track runners increases on their left leg much more than their right leg. And we know that the eversion strength of the right leg increases more than the left leg. That's because they're always running in that counterclockwise fashion, right? I would guess, and this, I don't think it's been studied that I know of, but I would guess that the gluteus medius on the right would also be stronger than the left, right? Now, if someone tested these runners and saw the asymmetry, they're prone to think, oh, an asymmetry, that's a problem. But no, it's not a problem, it's an adaptation. And we have to remember that the body is really good at adapting to the loads that we place on it. And then last slide on this idea, we know that all these studies show that higher running workloads, these are all specifically on running, may actually be protective of injury. So less injuries in these runners in these studies that have higher running volumes because their capacity is so high because the load is so high. Okay, so the next scenario that I have is a slow decrease in load. So in other words, if you're a sedentary person or if you get injured and you overprotect things and you stop running for a long time, you're going to see the capacity go down. Now, I don't think I need to really put a lot of studies up on this, but generally we all know if you don't apply a lot of load, then you're going to have low capacity, right? Specifically on runners, we have these studies where we know that novice runners who obviously have a lower capacity than more experienced runners are much more likely to get injured, okay? This next scenario that I have is one that we typically see in the office very frequently. A fast increase in load injures the tissue because the body doesn't have time to adapt, and then you get tissue damage and the capacity goes down, right? So again, we have lots of studies on that. A rapid increase in workload is going to increase the injury risk. Rapid changes in footwear also are going to increase the risk. If you change the load really quickly and your body doesn't have time to adapt, you're increasing the risk of injury. All right. And then the last scenario that I have is one that I personally think is probably the most important, but yet it's also the most overlooked. So in this case, someone is going to keep the load the same, but the capacity is decreased because of things like stress, poor sleep, dietary changes, certain medications, and things like that. What that does is it lowers your ability to heal, like to repair itself after exercise, or those that influence because of psychosocial aspects of pain, right? So lowered capacity can lower the ability of the body to repair itself after every workout, and so you get this imbalance in the load and the capacity. So when I bring this up during teaching for the running clinic or with my own patients, I think people give me a little eye roll. Maybe I'm internalizing that, but I think people openly question how big of a role stress actually plays, and sleep actually plays, and diet actually plays in injury. So I'm going to put up a couple studies here just because I want to illustrate like how big these effect sizes are. So this paper in 2017 with over 2,000 children, those with poor sleep had a 114% increased risk of injury. That is a huge effect size. Milewski in 2014, same thing. Athletes who are adolescents who slept less than 8 hours were 70% more likely to get injured. And then Van Rosen kind of flipped it where he said athletes sleeping more than 8 hours reduced their odds of injury by 61%. And then this paper on Johnson, this was on adults. They followed 95 endurance athletes for a year, and there was a significant association to sleeping less than 7 hours and subsequent injury. This was an interesting study because there was like a 14-day lag to when they sustained the injury compared to when they started reducing their sleep. So those are pretty big effect sizes. So if we move on to stress, this Nussbaum study in 2019, lower sleep and higher stress was correlated to more stress fractures than those who had adequate sleep and lower stress. Luana Main, down in Australia, again, 2010, she followed triathletes for a year, and she tracked their load, like their total amount of exercise for the week. And if there was a spike in load, then there was a spike in injury. But she also had them fill out a psychological questionnaire. And if there was a spike in psychological stress, that correlated with injury as well. In fact, it correlated with injury better than the spike in exercise volume did. So in her study, stress played a bigger role in injury than training load did. So that's pretty interesting. Messier in 2018, 300 runners for 2 years, lower mental health quality of life and more negative emotions were predictors of injury. But what's interesting about this study is if you read on, they go on to say these factors were not an etiologic factor for injuries like arch height, Q angle, lower extremity strength, weekly mileage, footwear, previous injury. Those didn't correlate to injury, but lowered mental health, quality of life, and negative emotions were correlated with injury. So then the last thing I just want to go over here real quick is diet. We know that, you know, with the female athletic triad, we call it REDS now with relative energy deficiency in sport. So this paper was done in 2014, and in distance runners, obviously females, because we're talking about amenorrhea, 65% of them were suffering from that. And then low energy availability, which is one of the components of REDS, 80% of male endurance athletes suffered from that. So these two studies show us the prevalence of REDS in endurance athletes is really large. This was a paper that looked at 16 different collegiate sports, and cross-country runners accounted for the vast majority of the bone stress injuries, and the cross-country runners were at highest risk of REDS, okay? And then we know from this study that if you have REDS, you're more than 4 times likely to suffer an injury compared to people who aren't suffering from REDS. And then if you're getting the recommended nutrient intake, you can reduce the odds of injury by 64%. So the reason I put those up there again is because I think capacity is massively overlooked, and we're going to talk about that further as we go ahead here. So what your job is as a clinician or a runner is to take track of all of these factors on the left that are influencing the amount of load on the body, okay? But you also need to look at these factors on the right that influence capacity. So as a clinician, what you need to do is take all of these factors and put them together in the old Venn diagram type situation, but you take all that information and you put it together to form a clinical picture of what's going on with your patient, okay? So why is load and capacity so important? Well, I'm gonna go over this fairly quickly, but it's important because all of these other factors, which have been covered this weekend, aren't really big factors when it comes to creating injuries in running. So our running related injuries caused by wearing the wrong shoes, and I know Trevor talked about this, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but this is the old classic wet footprint test where you assign a shoe based on the arch type. There's a few studies on that. NAPIC, 3 randomized control studies with over 7,000 people, and one group got assigned a shoe based on the arch type, and the other group just was given a stability shoe. And there's actually slightly lower rates of injury in the group that wasn't given a shoe based on their arch type. Mike Ryan in 2011, this was 81 female half marathoners. Same sort of principle as far as the methodology of the study went. An assignment of a shoe based on the arch type or just randomly given any shoe. And again, really no difference between groups. So the Mike Ryan study summarized it by saying this study shows that our current approach to prescribing in-shoe pronation control based on the foot type is simplistic and can potentially actually cause injury. And then this study, this was by Fukuda, and they said it has never been demonstrated that running-related injuries can be prevented by wearing a certain shoe type based on matching it to the foot morphology, okay? So shoes are not really responsible for injuries. What about pronation? Again, I know Trevor talked about this. I'm going to just gloss over it really quickly. This was a paper by Ben O'Nig, and his quote is, "The results of our study show that the pronated foot position is, if anything, an advantage with respect to running injuries." So again, not a big deal, right? And he says it's difficult to find any supporting evidence that pronation is a predictor of running injuries. So again, and yeah, I had to put up the picture of 𝐒𝐲𝐞𝐞 there that Trevor put up. But pronation, not really a link to injuries, okay? So as Nick Knight said yesterday, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? What about weakness? And again, I know Claire covered a lot of this. I just want to go over a couple points here. If we read studies like this, where it says females with patellofemoral pain have weak hip muscles, this is a systematic review. And again, this study here that concluded runners with patellofemoral pain display weaker hip abductor muscles. You're going to think, oh, wow, people who are weak in their hips are more likely to get knee pain. But, and this is a big but, you have to remember in these papers, these are papers in people with patellofemoral pain. So that's an association, that's not causation, right? And we know that if you have pain, you're probably going to run differently. So there's this thing called arthrogenic muscle inhibition. And this is a situation where I think college kids must sign up for these studies because they want some beer money. But they inject this noxious, painful substance into people's knees. And then they do like jump landing tests before they inject it and after. And after you inject the knee with some painful substance, we know that knee pain, the experimental knee pain, actually inhibits like the gastroc and the medial hamstring and the glute medius muscle during landing. So it would follow then that if you're looking at people with patellofemoral pain and trying to figure out, you know, why they run like that, you can't really figure that out because they're in pain. So how do you know how they would run otherwise, right? And if you're saying, well, this was on jumping and landing, okay, fine, let's look at one with running. This was the same sort of thing, experimental anterior knee pain on runners. And again, they found that the vastus medialis, lateralis, and gastroc are all inhibited by anterior knee pain, experimental anterior knee pain. So, you know, we have to take that with a grain of salt when we look at these studies that, you know, they're cross-sectional studies where you're looking at a group of runners with pain as opposed to a prospective study, which is different. That's when you look at the way a bunch of runners run when they're not in pain, and then you track them for a year and you see who gets injured. But this was a good paper by Runchatlive where he was looking at hip strength as a risk factor for patellofemoral pain. And he said there's actually no association between hip strength and the risk of developing patellofemoral pain. And hip strength deficit is a result of rather than a cause of patellofemoral pain. So we can conclude that weakness isn't really a big factor in running related injuries. And then again, I know I'm skimming through this, but what about flexibility? This was a study by Claire Baxter, a systematic review. And she said, look at either acute or chronic static stretching has any clinical benefit on performance or reducing DOMs or preventing injuries. So, you know, it doesn't seem like inflexibility is really a factor that's associated with running injuries either. So unfortunately, if you interview runners, which is what this study did, and you ask them what strategies do they consider effective in preventing injuries, 75% of them think stretching is a good way to prevent injuries, which we know is not true, but that's what the public thinks. In that same study, 68% of them thought that appropriate footwear was a way to prevent injury, okay? So we know that's not true. So what I'm not saying, please understand this before you get angry at me at the end of this. I'm not saying to completely ignore strength and footwear and biomechanics. Okay, let's just get that straight before anybody gets angry with me. What I am saying is that load and capacity is a much higher priority than footwear and biomechanics and absolute load. Okay, so let's say you believe me. Let's pretend for a second that you believe me that load and capacity is one of the biggest factors with running injury and preventing it and actually getting people back to running. How would we go about quantifying that? Well, we can start with measuring, right? Everybody wants to measure things. Everybody walks into any building these days and you get measured. And even Matt, I know Matt likes to measure certain things on Friday and Saturday nights, or even some other nights of the week. But Everybody wants to measure everything, right? So we can start with this acute to chronic workload ratio, right? Chris Napier had a paper that came out about 2 weeks ago looking at running volume and RPE. And Greg Lehman talked about this a little bit over the lunch break. So the basic idea is, this is Tim Gabbett's work on acute to chronic workload ratio, where you look at the running volume and you look at the rate of perceived exertion. Okay, so that's fine, great. That's one way to measure load, right? But are you going to increase the load in someone as quickly if they have REDS versus someone who doesn't? I don't think so. So once you quantify the acute to chronic workload ratio, you have to understand that that's going to be different for someone with REDS than someone without REDS. Okay, so now we have to quantify REDS. Okay, great. We have some ways of doing that. There's these questionnaires that outline the risk of REDS. Okay, great. So now we have load, RPE, and REDS. But what about stress? If someone is stressed, are you going to increase the running volume as much as someone who isn't stressed? Okay, now we can quantify stress, right? We have all these questionnaires. They're like 70 questions long, and your patient's going to get a little pissy every time they have to fill that out every week. But whatever, you can use them if you want. If you want to get fancier, yeah, you can do blood markers and saliva markers to measure someone's stress. You can use heart rate variability. You can do all sorts of things, okay? My point is, if we look at volume, let's say you have a patient coming in and you want to increase their volume, or you're a runner and you want to increase your volume. You can look at the research, okay? So we have this like 10% rule. Everybody likes the 10% rule of increasing volume. But then Ida Buist's paper, the Groner Run study in 2007, where they found that it's actually safe to increase the running volume by 20%. And then you look at Rasmus Nielsen's paper in 2014, where he increased it by 30%, and you know that was a risk factor for injury. So maybe somewhere between 10 and 30%, which is a pretty wide range. But let me ask you this: are you going to increase the volume in someone who's 65 at the same rate that you're going to increase the volume in somebody who's 18? I don't think so. So you have to take age into account when you're increasing the volume, right? What about the running experience? We know that as a novice runner, you're more likely to get injured. So why would we increase the running volume as quickly in someone who's a novice runner compared to someone who's an experienced runner? Okay, what about stress? Stress plays a role in injuries, so maybe we have to take that into account. What about sleep? If someone's not sleeping well? What about previous injury? If someone's really injury prone, are we going to increase their volume as quickly, right? You have all these factors that play a role that you have to think about when you're increasing the running volume. Same goes for intensity. I'm not going to increase the rate of intensity like track workout in someone who's 60 compared to somebody who's 20. And so we have to take that into account. We have to take all of these factors into account. Same with footwear. You know, if someone has a history of Achilles problems and you want to maybe switch them to a more minimalist shoe for whatever reason, maybe they also have knee pain, and so you want to lower the load on the knee. I'm not going to increase their exposure to a minimalist shoe if they have a history of Achilles problems, or if they have diabetes. Like I'm not going to increase the exposure to a minimalist shoe in someone with significant diabetes. And you have to take all these factors into account. We can say the same thing with running form. We can say the same thing with surface and non-running activities as well, right? So I hope you're understanding the point of what I'm getting at here. Healthcare is not a science. It's partly a science, but it's not exclusively a science, right? It's also an art. And we have to remember that when we're looking at all of these papers and we're arguing on Twitter about what this study said and that study said, healthcare is as much an art as it is a science, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of patients can't really deal with that, and a lot of clinicians can't deal with that idea. But we have to understand it's a complex interplay of biology as well as social or psychosocial issues, and it's not always quantifiable. So if you remember, this section was about quantifying load and capacity. I'm not so sure we can quantify it. There's too many things going on. So, Todd Hargrove was recently on this podcast called, what was it called? Runchatlive, I think is what it was called. And he talked about this difference between complicated and complex. So what complicated means is you have straight line, step-by-step solutions that tend to be predictable. So like learning algebra or designing a car or a rocket ship, that's complicated, but it's straightforward. Complex is different. Those are sort of confounding, head-scratching ideas with really no right answer. It's just best attempts. There's no straight line to a solution. Okay, that's what healthcare is. It's like getting your child to behave. That's a complex thing. There's a lot of different interplay and factors that go along with that. So when we think about healthcare being complex, I don't want you to get discouraged. Okay, there is actually hope. In fact, I think it's better this way. So instead of having to quantify leg length and navicular drop and Q angle and acute to chronic workload ratio and pages of psychosocial questionnaires, pronation angles and the angle of the knee in the frontal plane, and measuring the ratio of their thumb to their finger, like whatever, you have to quantify all this crap. What I'm suggesting is it's easier than that. Okay, it's much easier than that. So I don't like sitting through presentations where all you hear is fanciful language about like theoretical concepts, and we get told that we're doing everything wrong, and yet the presenter doesn't offer a better solution. Tell me what to do. So that's what I'm about to do here. I hope all you need is this one tool. Okay, it's not a fancy tool. It's not an expensive tool. In fact, it's free. And the great news is everyone watching this presentation has this tool. Okay. So what is this one tool? What's this one tool that can gather all of this information together? And I'm going to warn you, it's not sexy. It's your history taking. Okay. It's the best tool you have. If you sit down and you take a history, like a proper history, you can get all of the information that you need. And I know it's a cliche, but your patient has all the information that you need. All you have to do is listen. Okay, with a proper history and a working brain on your part, you can tackle just about anything. So let's take a look at a couple examples here. So we have a 43-year-old female runner with 10 years experience. She's training for her 4th marathon and she has knee pain. She has no history of knee pain or injuries before this. You do a gait eval and it shows that she's rear foot striking. And the therapist says, oh, well, I've read these studies that say that a rear foot strike increases the patellofemoral joint forces. So if I switch her to a forefoot strike, that reduces those forces. Okay, great. You do it, you do a gait test, you ask her to switch to a forefoot strike, and miraculously the knee pain goes away. So you tell her, hey, you got to start switching to a forefoot strike. This, by the way, is in the middle of marathon training when her volume is high. So as a result, she gets an Achilles tendinopathy or a metatarsal stress fracture, and she has to pull out of the marathon. Okay, so what happened? Well, she's done 3 marathons with the same gait pattern and she was fine. Why would you ever think that it's her gait? That doesn't make sense. But you didn't do a proper history taking and you find out that she's going through a divorce and she's sleeping less than 4 hours a night. And she's also trying to get a PB. So she's increased her pace and she's not used to it. Okay. Since the #1 cause of injury is a change in the load and capacity, now you're the one responsible for her metatarsal stress fracture. Not good. What could you have done better? Well, first, take a better history. You can explain the idea of load and capacity. Reassure her that she actually runs well. She's done 3 marathons. She's been fine. This was just a training error. You can tell her to slow down, reduce the total volume. If you read 𝐒𝐿's paper on patellofemoral pain, you know that education is probably the most important factor. So if she walks down the hills, that's going to reduce the load for a little bit. And you can just make it symptom-based management. Sure, you can do some hip and quad and core strengthening, because like what we talked about, there's probably going to be some inhibition to those muscles because she has pain. So yeah, go ahead, start some strengthening, because we know that if you do that, people with patellofemoral pain get back to running quicker. Okay, maybe increase the cadence if you want to make a gait change. We know it's one of the safest ways to go, but base that on her symptoms. Okay. Case number 2, this is the second and last case. I promise I'm not going to keep you guys much longer. 18-year-old female runner with 5 years of running experience, and now she has shin pain. So you do a gait eval, and this is what you see. So on the right side, you're like, oh, wow, look at that. Her right leg, which is the symptomatic leg, has some hip adduction and some dynamic knee valgus. That's probably creating a bending moment in the tibia. So we're going to fix that. Okay, great. So the therapist says, well, we're going to give you some 𝐒𝐲𝐞𝐈𝐒𝐿 to cushion the run. And we're going to give you some glute strengthening to reduce the hip adduction and some orthotics to help with the dynamic knee valgus. But you can keep running in the 𝐒𝐻𝐾𝐠. All right, so as a result, she suffers a tibial stress fracture and her season is over. And again, it's your fault. Where'd you go wrong? Well, we know that increased cushioning like 𝐒𝐻𝐾𝐠 has actually been shown to increase loading rates, not decrease them. That's in most people. Not everybody, as we talked about yesterday. It's obviously, you know, subject specific, but most people, it increases the rate. Okay, and then strengthening a muscle, like you want to strengthen the glutes to reduce the hip adduction. Strengthening a muscle in isolation does not change gait mechanics. So don't worry about that. But you failed to ask her about diet, her menstrual cycle, and her training. So it turns out she's already thin. She's trying to lose more weight, and she hasn't had a period in 3 months. And you didn't even ask about that. So again, better solution. History taking. Explain RED-S to the girl and the parents. Explain the importance of it and the importance of it having enough calories. You know, refer to a nutritionist if you're not knowledgeable about that. She can definitely do some low impact cross training. And if you read this paper by Warden, this was Stu Warden in JOSPT in 2014. This is a fantastic paper on bone stress injuries. And if somebody has a medial tibial stress fracture, basically the return to running is symptom based. And Tom covered that in his presentation today. It was a great presentation that he had on that. So the usual approach is looking at these things on the left, like flat feet and weakness and you're too old or whatever. And what that does is it makes the patient feel like this. I run wrong, I'm built wrong, I need an orthotic or I need to run. So you take their self-efficacy away, right? The load and capacity approach is, you know what, you actually run well. Variability is normal in running style and anatomy. And Ben had a great presentation on talking about that. And you can adapt, okay? You just overdid it this time, no big deal. The situation on the left, unfortunately, promotes dependency and discouragement and a lack of confidence. And the load versus capacity approach promotes independence and encouragement and self-confidence, okay? So putting it all together, these things on the left, gait analysis and shoes and laser treatment and colorful tape, you know, that's great. If you want to be a salesman, that's great. I'm not so sure it's good to be doing those because they're not really supported in the literature, but it's great if you want to be a salesman. They're flashy. It's cool. Proper history taking and common sense principles, I'd say that's a much better way. All right. So I have this quote, simple solutions are often best. A wise woman I know said that once, which is probably why I married her, but I like that quote, so I'm putting it up. Number 2, we don't have to measure everything, okay? Just take a proper history. If you're not doing this with your patients, where you're sitting there listening to them for, you know, I'd say at least 30 minutes to get a thorough history, you're probably not getting the details you need. You know, Alex Hutchinson and Izzy Moore were on yesterday during that lunch situation. And they were talking about gait analysis online. And they said, that's fine. Gait analysis online is fine if you also have a consultation. But if you don't have a consultation, a gait analysis in and of itself alone is probably worthless. Okay? So measure only what you need and then put it all together. Remember, healthcare is as much a science as it is an art. So do some painting. Totally fine. Not everything has to be science-based. Okay, Alice did a great job of talking about that a minute ago. And instead of tearing your patients down, empower them. Okay, don't tear them down. Don't let them leave the office with 5 problems. They only came in with 1 problem and now you've given them 5 different things to think about. Just empower them, okay? So last year, the last speaker was Mike James, and he finished the last presentation with the last slide being a quote from me. So I only thought it was appropriate that I return the favor. So as Mike said last year, if the only thing you take away from me and my time talking to you today is this, then I've done my job okay. So thank you to everybody. Shout out to Matt for putting this all together, and I look forward to meeting you guys next year in person, I hope. Take it away, Matt.
Brilliant. Oh my God. Hold on. Let me just make sure I've got this down right. Healthcare is as much about art as it is science. Do some painting. Oh, that's just like, that's gonna be everywhere. The first person can make a meme of that. That is just spot on. Beautiful. Yeah, do some painting, people. Very nice. I like it. Amazing, mate. Well done. Fantastic talk. It's great. And also even incorporating your wife into it, bonus points. Amazing. Simple solutions are often best.
That'll work out well for me.
Oh, emotional. Look at Mike sitting there. Look at that smile you put on his little face. Look at him. This year, Runchatlive 2020 ends with a quote from the person who used Kevin Mags last year in 2019. Oh, it's beautiful. Right, that was amazing. That was really, really good, Kevin. I had no doubts it was going to be. It was fantastic. So much in there. Right, let's open it up for some questions from people. Same, if you just joined us, we haven't been in the kind of question section yet, then you can either stick your hand up physically or you can stick a little glue hand up in your camera. If you're off camera and you still want to ask a question, then you can put it into JF is still walking. He is. 3 hours later, he's still walking. Yeah. So if you've got a question, you can put it into the comment section and we'll still read you out. I don't want to feel that people feel they have to get on camera to ask questions. So
JF and I did a presentation online for Brazil about 3 months ago. And I think it was probably 5 hours long and he walked the entire time.
Oh my God, I can't believe it. It's brilliant. That's tickled me. Right, okay, so let's go questions because for 4 o'clock we'll go to the 90-minute question time, but let's hit Kevin with some stuff, people. So Alice, you're there. Let's go for it.
Here. Yeah, that was a great presentation, and you have a lot of things that I was hoping to see someone address. The studies we were talking about, the swimmers experiencing more disc degeneration than runners, does exercise in someone who already has disc degeneration help to reverse it? I know it can help people feel better, but does it reverse or slow down degeneration?
Yeah, so that was an interesting presentation I did. It was like a 2-hour presentation to the Australian Chiropractic Association on that. I think the evidence isn't that clear on humans. It seems like it is. We have sort of associative evidence that says that the more you exercise, the more likely you are to have good discs in terms of running. Certain sports like heavy weightlifting, no, that's actually not the case. Swimming, certain sports actually are associated with higher rates of disc degeneration. But running is the one sport that really is associated with really good association with disc health. There's a lot of animal studies, so in vitro studies and in vivo studies that show that yes, the disc can actually adapt to load. And it's a lengthy topic because there's a lot of things that influence the disc. One of the main things, believe it or not, is the end plate and the capillary density in the actual vertebra, because that helps the nutrient exchange to get out of the disc, like it gets metabolites out and nutrients in. And obviously exercise is a way to help increase the capillary density, everywhere in our body. And so there's some thought about that. But, if you look at astronauts, believe it or not, have a 23-fold, like 23 times more likely to suffer a cervical disc herniation in the year that they get back from being in space. So not while they're in space, but when they get back over the next year, they have a 23 times more likely risk of having disc herniations. And they think it's simply because they're offloaded for so long. So that's like a negative aspect, like that deconditioning type thing. So it's a really fascinating topic. I do think that that you can create an anabolic effect in the discs with certain types of exercise.
For people who are not runners, are there other forms of exercise that you think might help?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a really interesting topic because like we know that the disc doesn't respond well to heavy load, but it does respond to light load. And so what running is a light load extremely repetitively. And they think that's maybe why it creates increased 𝐒𝐲𝐞𝐚𝐤𝐞𝐫 content in the nucleus and increased collagen synthesis in the annulus. So if they're not runners, I would just start exposing them to some hopping, like jump rope, jumping jacks type things. I would get some light impact into the routine as well as some strength training.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, JF, I think you got a question in there with your little blue hand up.
Yeah, absolutely. Great talk, Kevin. That was pretty amazing. I just wanted to ask you, like, what your experience is when you have someone coming to see you for an injury and they think that it's related to their body and how they're built, how they run and all that stuff, but then you start talking about these like other factors that are related to capacity. Like, what's your experience explaining that to people and how well is it received? Because most people would think that it's not the reason why they get injured.
Right. Yeah. So I am not a counselor, but I think you have to sort of get a gauge for the patient. Some people are going to respond to logic. Some people are going to respond to emotion. Some people are going to respond to more visual type stuff. So, I made that video. If anybody wants to just Google load and capacity, you'll find the video that I made last year. And you're free to use that in your office. It's a little 4-minute video that helps explain it. But I sort of get a feel for how into it they are. And then I pick my battles. If they're talking about oh, I need this shoe because of my pronation, or I have an eye arch and I need this shoe, and I have this knee valgus, and I have a leg length discrepancy, and do you have laser? Because my last PT used the laser and that really helped. And it's like, there's only so many things you can tackle. I think if you overwhelm them with too many conflicting ideas, then they're gonna start fighting back. So I kind of take one thing at a time and just pick my battles and then slowly expose them. It's like graded exposure to different philosophical ideas as they go. But I try not to overwhelm them too much on day one.
Great stuff. What else we got? Well, let's have a look in the chat, just in case there's people who are not actually on video who'd like a little question here. Let me go down, go down, go down. It's about cushioning. No one in the chat waiting. No. Anything else for Kevin, people? Hold your hand up now. Go, Alice, we're back.
Not so much a question, but a comment. I haven't seen all presentations because of the time change. But I was thinking last night, I wonder how much attention is paid to really listening to the client and taking into consideration these other biomechanical factors. And so it's, I'm really enjoying hearing bring up this in a really very articulate way, and also the idea of keeping it simple, because massage therapists suffer from this too, of wanting things to be complicated, and keeping it simple and staying with principles. So I just want to express my appreciation for that, because it's important.
Yeah, I agree.
That's it.
Keeping things simple is definitely an important thing, and I think I was shouting out to Mike James, but that was kind of the main point of his presentation, and I think to yours as well. Like, let's not get too bogged down in the research. Let's try to keep things simple.
Yeah. And like you say, it's not that things like biomechanics aren't important. They all have their place, but it's often those kind of things, the technical aspects have been emphasized, and the psychosocial aspects and these other areas like sleep and things like that have been overlooked.
I completely agree. Yeah, it's just, I think biomechanics and footwear shouldn't be ignored. they're just lower on the totem pole than those other factors.
Yeah.
Load and capacity, right? Yeah.
And the thing that you said, you're not a psychologist or a counselor, I'll hear that, especially from physical therapists, but some massage therapists also. And I think that, we're not pretending to be that, and we just have to be human beings. We don't have to be a trained psychologist to listen that, like you say, this person is going through a divorce and they're not getting much sleep and all that. You don't have to have a PhD in psychology to see that can be a factor.
No, you don't need a PhD.
So,
but what you need
anyway,
is good history taking. Because if you don't ask those things about, how's your life right now? How's work? People will look at you strange initially, like, why the hell is it any of your business? You have to figure out a way to say it nicely. But if you're not taking a proper history, you're not going to get that information out. And sometimes, people are a little closed off about it. They don't want to talk about it. And that's fine. As you get to know them a little bit better, you can start teasing that information out of them.
Yeah. Well, and also the thing you said about adapting to that person, paying attention, how do they communicate? Some people are sophisticated and they want to know a lot of things, and they have a greater vocabulary, and other people, they're very concrete, and it just, we have to listen to them and adapt to their form of communication. And I love the idea that you presented about graded exposure around education. No, it really, a lot of good stuff there, and expressed really well in a way that is very easy to understand and apply it.
Great, thank you.
We've got a question here in the chat from Steph, who I don't think is on cam. So Steph Creaturo says, Kevin, this was terrific. Thank you. Can you please share one or two effective ways that you've educated runners on the importance of quality sleep and stress management? I find so many runners simply roll their eyes at me when I discuss sleep and stress as huge factors that impact their training. I'm based in New York, and there are so many runners who live in the highest stress life and wear it as a badge of honor, like no pain, no gain. Seriously outdated mindset, but it still persists. I'm not on camera. Homeschool and spouse has a huge presentation going on. There you go. That's from Steph Creatura.
Right. So similar to JF's point, the JF's question there, like, I have that video on load and capacity that I'll show to people, but I tend to know a lot of these studies, so I'll sort of like rack off a few studies if they're coming from a logical standpoint, and I'll talk about the importance of sleep and tissue recovery, because I think it is something that people need to understand. But when I was on your podcast, Matt, I don't know if you remember this, I was talking about what Derek Griffin said last year. So those different approaches that I just sort of outlined are more logical type situations, but people can be convinced on emotional grounds too. And I think Derek used some examples last year about, if you have a neighbor who's like 40 years old and they die of a heart attack, people often say, well, yeah, but he had this high stress job, and so that's probably why he had a heart attack. And they don't see a problem in tying a psychosocial problem to a physical manifestation, like a heart attack, right? And then you can also say, like, especially like in these times with COVID, we know your immune system goes down when you're not sleeping well and when you're stressed out. Those are very well established, things. And people say that all the time, even before COVID, like, oh, my wife got the flu, but I didn't, but she got it because she's like completely stressed out and she doesn't sleep well, so she's vulnerable to it. And that's another physical manifestation of a psychologic problem. Does that make sense? So if you sort of give examples like that and then say, look at these, there's a lot of other physical manifestations of these psychosocial issues like sleep and stress. I think you can find one of those ways, whether it's visual or citing studies or just coming up with examples like that can sort of drive the point home and find a way to get through to your patient to have them understand that concept. But sometimes it takes repetition and it takes different ways of approaching the topic before they start to understand it.
I'm just going to check as you're speaking. Is it just, I'm not sure if it's just me, but as you're speaking, it sounds like maybe there's a wire flapping against something. Is anyone else hearing that, or is it just me?
Sorry. No, that was you.
Yeah, no, there's people nodding away.
I'm just kidding.
It was me. I don't know if there's anything we can do about it, but I'm just thinking about for the next hour and a half. I don't know. What are you listening through? Is it a, have you got a, is there a wire?
No, I was on the table and I was kind of shaking the table.
Oh, is it that? Oh, that's what it is. Oh, we know what it is now. That's cool. That's fine. I do want it to detract from what you were saying. That's all. Cool. Right. There's submit that. There's more questions coming in through the chat section. We're over time. 3:57. We're okay. Let's go through and see Laura. That was Laura Wilson. How do you? Here we go. How do you approach the nutrition side of things? Not necessarily with people who have an eating disorder, but who rely on quick fix energy boosters like gels, etc.
So that depends on what distance they're doing. I mean, if someone's doing like a 10K, I don't think nutrition is that important during the race. I know some people might argue that. Nutrition is certainly not like a massive knowledge base of mine. On a personal note, when I used to do Ironman and whatnot, I tended to use that brand called Infinite. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that, but it's like a customized program where you tell them, how well you respond to nutrition, and they customize the formula where they add the protein and the glucose and the carbohydrates and the electrolytes and caffeine if you want, and it's all customizable. But I think the longer distance you go, obviously, the more important nutrition comes into it. But to be honest, nutrition during a race is not really my strong point. If I'm understanding that question properly.
I think so. Maybe just with respect to, I read it as maybe just with respect to general performance and just being able to train properly, reach your potential.
Yeah,
just along the way.
So that's where I don't get into nutrition that much, because I think, with respect to the same principle I have for most other things, I try to keep it simple. I don't get into these fad diets. I just try to keep a balanced diet, fruits and veggies and some lean meat, and I don't see a problem with that. The trouble with runners is just the fact that, you've got to make sure that they're having enough calories for the caloric expenditure that they're going through.
Cool. Okay then. Well, look, it's 3:59 now, and the other speakers are going to be collecting soon. The other quote, which I really enjoyed of yours, Kevin, I'm not sure if I heard it rightly, but apparently you said that hookers have been shown to increase loading rates.
Right on cue, and Simon Spooner is trying to enter the room. Yeah, there's a few studies on that.
I don't think, even when I say it now, maybe it's a British thing, but basically I'm hearing hookers.
Oh, hookers.
Oh, okay. Because you can see where the problem was.
Yeah, well, if you're going to a hookah bar, then that's up to you.
Loading rate's going to be all over the place.
It's going to be crazy.
I was just being facetious. It did make me chuckle. Right, did Spooner come in? Did you say fantastic? Well, look, right, Kevin, it was amazing. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. We can continue the chat. I'm sure that I've got a list of things now, which I'm hoping will come up, but I'm always going to let other people first raise some points. But we're going to have 90 minutes now, people, of basically points to do with, again, I mean, it's been the whole thing, how to put evidence back into running injury, running performance. So great show, Kevin. Thank you very much for closing in that way. People, if you'd like a couple of minutes to go and do your thing while the speakers get ready and on cam, then we'll start again in a couple of minutes for a little 90-minute session on whatever you guys want. You're listening to Runchatlive podcast, putting the evidence back into running injury and performance.